Would you be saying to Donald Trump, if you were still advising him, President Putin is playing you?
I think President Trump has got, some kind of an inkling of this right now, but he just wouldn't want to admit it.
In the last hour, Russia has announced its delegation attending the Turkey peace talks tomorrow with Ukraine. As it stands, President Putin's name is not on the list. Shortly before that announcement, I spoke to one of the world's most eminent Russia experts, Dr. Fiona Hill. She worked for President Trump in his first term as his deputy assistant and senior director for European and Russian affairs, so she knows the American president well. What does she think will happen tomorrow?
I don't actually expect President Putin to show up. However, if he did, I think that could really become a major game changer in very many respects. So, you shouldn't rule it out entirely. And I mean, if he did, he would obviously want to kind of push things completely in his direction by, really doing something that nobody's anticipating. Because, I mean, obviously President Zelensky doesn't expect him to come. I doubt that Erdogan expects him to show up in Turkey either. And, Trump is still hedging on this, although he is out there in the vicinity. And obviously if Putin did show up, Trump would, be able to pivot in that direction.
What might President Trump do you think, if President Putin doesn't show up?
He could express disappointment. He's probably going to keep on pushing Zelensky, to make more concessions in the hope that Putin would show up. But look, I mean, I think you can also see, because of the nature of Trump's, really quite groundbreaking trip to the Middle East, that he's already contemplating moving on to, what he hopes is going to be other foreign policy successes. So, I mean, what he was really trying to do in getting Zelensky and Putin together was put himself at the centre of the action as the mediator par excellence in major conflicts. And he has many others that he's, trying to insert himself into at the moment. So although he may be disappointed, I think he's, trying to change the conversation and to keep himself at the centre of global attention.
You obviously work for President Trump. You've met President Putin multiple times. You've seen the two men in the same room together multiple times. Can you give us any insight into the psychology of what's going on in the two men's minds right now?
I think it's very different for both of them. For Trump, again, he wants to be at the centre of attention. And by being in the presence of Vladimir Putin, that in itself is part of the goal, because he likes to be seen in the company of big men. And who's bigger on the international stage than really Vladimir Putin or President Xi of China, for example? Trump doesn't like to be lost in a crowd, and he certainly wouldn't be in that instance. And he likes to have the kind of reflected glory from the meetings that he's engaging in. Now, for Putin, it's something quite different, because what Putin is trying to do is to manage Trump, and he's trying to manage Trump's attempts to kind of broker a peace in Ukraine and broker some kind of deal between President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Putin of Russia in a way that really suits Putin's interests. And frankly, I don't think it suits Putin's interest to end the war at this particular juncture. So he's trying to give Trump just enough to keep him interested, just enough to keep him in the game, and not enough to find some kind of resolution. Albeit, some small success and perhaps some declarative ceasefire to the war in Ukraine at this juncture.
And if you were still advising President Trump, bearing in mind what you've just said about President Putin, what would you be saying to Donald Trump right now?
Well, I'd be basically cautioning in terms of raising expectations of what could come out of this meeting in Istanbul. I mean, Trump, again, is looking for something symbolic. Maybe he'll get something at least symbolic rather than anything concrete. But look, for Putin right now, he is so heavily invested in this war, so heavily invested in securing control and domination of Ukraine and, other places in addition to that, in Europe being the dominant player in Europe. But he also has some real risks if he ended the war. The whole economy of Russia is completely militarized at this point, and ending the war abruptly or in, some immediate term could be very detrimental for Putin. What's he going to do in the absence of a war to keep the Russian economy going? How is he going to manage Russian society, which has now become highly militarized and very much focused on these aggressive relationships with Europe?
Would you be saying to Donald Trump, if you were still advising him, President Putin is playing you?
I think President Trump has got, some kind of an inkling of this right now, but he just wouldn't want to admit it. And look, Trump also doesn't like to hear this from any messenger who he sees as somewhat lesser to him in any case. So, if I had said that, I could probably be expected to be, sidelined if I'd got the opportunity to tell him that. I mean, Trump doesn't like to be told the obvious, but I think, by the rhetoric and by, his own massaging of the messages here, he's acknowledged that this isn't going according to his plan for sure. And as I said, he's trying to change the conversation, change the rhetoric and move on, to other arenas where he thinks he's going to have more success and, more ability to be able to control the narrative.
What does it tell us about Donald Trump that he will do business with world leaders who are pariahs, like President Putin, obviously, but also today we saw him meeting the interim president of Syria, a man who not that long ago had a $10 million bounty on his head because of his links with al-Qaeda?
Look, I think it just tells us that President Trump doesn't really make these kinds of distinctions. For him, a leader is a leader. The kind of context for a deal really matters. And, he's pretty pragmatic about everything. And look, and as we can see, he's pretty open to pretty much anything that people throw at him if he thinks that there's some advantage to him here. And obviously changing the whole direction in Syria is, quite complex. There's a whole host of different calculations that he's making there. It doesn't hurt that he's snubbing Netanyahu in Israel, who he's become, quite frustrated with, evidently. And it's an opportunity for, the United States to change direction, change course in the Middle East. And Trump is always looking to do something that's unusual, something that's out of the ordinary. And he honestly really doesn't care about the former status of someone. He's made that clear very many times, that he doesn't make these moral equivalencies that other people do.
Can I ask you, how has President Trump removing your security clearance, which you had because you previously worked for him, affected you?
Look, it hasn't in the slightest. I mean, to be frank, my security clearance would have expired after a 5-year period, and I certainly didn't make any effort to renew it. It was also meant to send a signal that, he's got you in the crosshairs. So, I took it for what it was. It was a performative action, but it was meant to say, look, don't cross me in any way.
Next week here in London, there is a big UK-EU summit. And the ambition from the UK government and from European leaders is that there will be a joint defence and security pact. How significant would that be, were they to achieve that, post-Brexit?
I think that would be extraordinarily significant. I think, look, we all fully acknowledge now with these changes in the United States, the European pillar of NATO and the European, broader security networks really have to be enhanced. And that can only be done through these kinds of partnerships. It also has to be private-public, not just intergovernmental. Personally, I think this is actually a very exciting period of change. It's one in which you could see growth driven across the United Kingdom and in other countries by reinvigoration and reinvestment in the defence sector. You're already seeing this in Poland, by the way. Poland is rapidly approaching 5% of GDP spending on defence and is using that as a motor for growth. And it's not just the government in Poland that's engaged, it's also the private sector.
Fiona Hill, thank you very much for talking to Newsnight this evening.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you for having me.